I stood at the head of the banquet table, champagne glass trembling in my hand as 30 pairs of eyes turned to me. Behind me, a banner proclaimed, Hayes Family Reunion 2025, in gaudy gold letters. My mother's smile froze when I clinked my fork against the glass. "I'd like to make a toast," I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. "To equal opportunity. Something I never had in this family." That's when the real celebration began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to the Hayes family reunion sat on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks before I found the courage to RSVP. Cream-colored cardstock with embossed gold lettering, the kind my mother always insisted on for important occasions. "Join us to celebrate family, legacy, and achievement," it read, like we were royalty instead of middle-class suburbanites with delusions of grandeur. I traced my finger over the words, achievement, feeling the bitterness rise like acid in my throat. Achievement. Right. The invitation had arrived the same day I'd made the final payment on my student loans. $87,450 paid over 8 excruciating years of double shifts, shared apartments with strangers, and declined invitations to anything. That cost more than a cup of coffee. 8 years of sacrifice while my younger brother Tyler lived in the fully funded comfort of our parents' generosity. 8 years of watching him graduate debt-free, buy his first home at 25, and build a comfortable life on the foundation they'd provided him but denied me. The achievement they wanted to celebrate at this reunion was Tyler's recent promotion to junior partner at his law firm, a position he'd reached 4 years faster than most because he hadn't spent his 20s juggling full-time work and night classes like I had. I almost threw the invitation away. Almost blocked my mother's number when she called to make sure I'd received it. Almost fabricated an emergency at work to avoid going. But something stopped me. Something that had been building for years, gathering strength with every loan payment, every missed opportunity, every patronizing, "We're so proud of how you've managed on your own, Eliza." It wasn't pride they felt. It was convenience. The convenience of having decided early that their daughter wasn't worth the investment their son was. I finally called my mother back on a Tuesday evening, after a particularly grueling shift at the hospital where I worked as a nurse. "I'll be there," I said, cutting through her small talk about the weather and Aunt Meredith's hip replacement. "Oh, wonderful." Her voice lilted with surprised pleasure. "Tyler will be so happy. He's been asking if you're coming." Of course he had. Tyler wasn't a bad person. That was part of what made the situation so complicated. He'd never asked for preferential treatment. He'd simply accepted what was offered without questioning why his sister hadn't received the same. Our parents had created the inequality, and he had benefited from it unknowingly, at least at first. "Will you be bringing anyone?" Mother continued, her tone shifting slightly, the way it always did when broaching the subject of my perpetually single status. "No," I replied flatly. "Just me." "Well, that's fine too," she said with practiced brightness that couldn't quite mask her disappointment. In her world, a 32-year-old woman should have a husband and at least 2 children by now. Another way I'd failed to meet expectations. After hanging up, I stood at my apartment window, looking out at the city, lights blinking on as dusk settled. My apartment was small but decent, in a neighborhood that was up and coming according to real estate agents and still sketchy according to my mother when she visited twice a year out of obligation. I'd made this life entirely on my own. Every piece of furniture, every certificate on my wall, every promotion I'd earned at the hospital, all of it came from my own hard work. There was pride in that, genuine pride. But there was also anger that refused to fade, a deep-seated sense of injustice that no amount of personal accomplishment seemed to erase. The decision had been made when I was 17. I'd come home, from school buzzing with excitement about my college acceptance letters. 3 universities had said yes, including my dream school, Northwestern, with its renowned nursing program. I'd spread the letters on the kitchen table, watching my parents' faces for the pride I was sure would be there. Instead, I saw discomfort. Exchange glances. My father clearing his throat while my mother suddenly became very interested in wiping down the already clean counter. "These are all great, Eliza," Dad had said finally, "but we need to talk about finances." That conversation changed everything. They explained, in reasonable, measured tones that seemed rehearsed, that they'd experienced investment losses. That the college fund they'd promised throughout my childhood had, unfortunately, not grown as expected. That they would help as much as possible, but I would need to take responsibility for my education. I'd nodded, swallowed my disappointment, and started researching scholarships and loans that night. I'd believed them. Why wouldn't I? Parents don't lie to their children about something so important. Parents don't play favorites with something as fundamental as education. Except mine had. 2 years later, when Tyler graduated high school with grades no better than mine, the investment losses had mysteriously reversed. The economy had turned around. Their financial advisor had made some smart moves. Whatever the excuse, the result was the same. Tyler was going to UCLA with all expenses paid, tuition, housing, meal plan, even a car to drive back home on weekends. I learned about it during a rare visit home from the state college I'd settled for, taking on a crushing loan burden even with my partial scholarship. I'd walked into the kitchen to find my mother assembling a care package for Tyler, boxes of his favorite snacks and new clothes spread across the counter. "Mom, what's all this?" I'd asked, already sensing something was off. "Oh, just some things for Tyler's dorm," she'd replied casually. "The poor boy says the food in the dining hall is terrible. And can you believe they charge $5 to do a load of laundry? Highway robbery." I stood there, thinking about how I'd been eating ramen for dinner 4 nights a week and washing my clothes in the bathroom sink to save on laundromat fees. I thought there wasn't money for college expenses, I said finally, my voice small. My mother's hands stilled briefly before continuing to fold a new sweater. "Well, your father's investments have done much better recently. And you know how boys are. Tyler isn't as resourceful as you. He needs more support." Resourceful. As if my working 30 hours a week while maintaining a full course load was some charming personality quirk rather than a necessity they'd forced upon me. That night, I'd confronted my father in his study, demanding the truth. The explanation came reluctantly, packaged in rationalizations that grew more offensive with each word. "Nursing is a practical career, Eliza. You can get a perfectly good education at a state school. Tyler wants to go into corporate law. Connections matter there. The prestige of the university will make a difference in his career in ways it simply won't in yours." The subtext was clear. My brother's ambitions mattered more. His future earned investment. Mine did not. I never forgot that conversation, though I buried my resentment deep, convincing myself that proving them wrong was better. Then confronting them, I excelled in my practical career, becoming the youngest charge nurse in my hospital's emergency department within 5 years of graduation. I lived frugally, sending large chunks of my salary to loan servicers every month while Tyler posted Instagram photos from spring break in Cancun and study abroad in Madrid. When he graduated and immediately secured a position at a prestigious firm, thanks in no small part to connections made through UCLA alumni, our parents threw him a lavish party. When I paid off my first loan, the achievement went unacknowledged. The pattern continued through our 20s. Tyler received down payment assistance for his first home. It's an investment in his future. I received kitchen appliances for Christmas. These will save you money in the long run. Tyler got extended stays at our parents' vacation property to decompress from work stress. I got questions about when I was going to find a more prestigious position at a better hospital. Through it all, I maintained a cordial relationship with my family. I called on birthdays and holidays. I sent appropriately thoughtful gifts. I attended important functions and smiled in photographs. I maintained the facade of the dutiful daughter while the inequality ate away at me like a cancer. Until the final student loan payment. There was no celebration, no congratulatory call from my parents, who knew the date was approaching, as I'd mentioned it during our last conversation. Just the anticlimactic click of a mouse as I transferred the money, and then a strange hollow feeling as I realized that for the first time in my adult life, my paycheck was truly my own. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and calculated what the difference in our starting positions had cost me. Not just the loan principal, but the interest. Not just the direct educational costs, but the opportunities missed because I'd been working instead of networking, surviving instead of thriving, the vacations not taken, the professional conferences I couldn't afford to attend, the better apartment in the safer neighborhood I'd had to wait years to afford. The financial disadvantage was quantifiable, but the emotional toll was not. The implicit message that I mattered less. The years spent believing I needed to justify my existence through achievement while my brother's worth was assumed. And now they wanted me to celebrate his latest achievement, to raise a glass and smile and perpetuate the fiction that we'd had equal chances. I dumped the rest of the wine down the sink and made a decision. The Hayes family reunion would still happen. I would still attend. But this time, I wouldn't be smiling in the photographs. This time, I had something to say. The 2 weeks before the reunion passed in a blur of preparation. Not the kind my mother would recognize. No new dress, no professional hairstyling, no carefully selected hostess gift. Instead, I prepared my mind, gathering evidence, rehearsing words, steeling myself against the inevitable backlash. I took a day off work to drive to my childhood home while my parents were at their country club's charity luncheon. I still had a key, though I rarely used it. The house felt smaller than I remembered. The formal living room with its untouched furniture, the updated kitchen where no real cooking ever happened, the precisely arranged family photos telling a carefully curated story of familial harmony. I went to my father's study, finding it unchanged, the leather chair, the bookshelves filled with business texts and biographies of successful men, the filing cabinet where he kept important documents. The cabinet wasn't locked. It never was. My father's confidence in his authority had always been absolute. It never occurred to him that anyone would dare look through his papers without permission. The financial records were organized with meticulous precision. Tax returns, investment statements, education accounts. I found what I was looking for quickly. The 529 college savings plans. One in my name, one in Tyler's. I took photos with shaking hands, my suspicions confirmed in black and white. Both accounts had been funded equally until I turned 15. Then the contributions to mine had stopped entirely, while Tyler's continued to grow. There had been no investment losses, no financial setback that necessitated my taking on debt. There had been a choice, a deliberate, calculated decision to invest in one child and not the other. I replaced the files exactly as I'd found them and left the house, a strange calm settling over me. The truth was no longer something I suspected, but couldn't prove. Now it was documented, irrefutable. The day of the reunion arrived with picture-perfect weather, as if even the elements were conspiring to create my parents' vision of the ideal family gathering. The event was being held at an upscale country club near my parents' home, in a private banquet room with views of the perfectly manicured golf course. I dressed with care, not to impress, but to armor myself. A sleek black dress that communicated professionalism rather than celebration. Minimal jewelry. Hair pulled back severely, no vulnerability on display. As I drove to the venue, I rehearsed my words one final time. Not a rant, not an emotional outburst that could be dismissed as hysteria. Just facts, presented clearly, followed by boundaries established firmly. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles when I arrived. I parked my practical Honda between my uncle's Mercedes and my cousin's Range Rover, another visible reminder of the different paths our lives had taken. Inside, the reunion was already in full swing. About 30 relatives mingled around high-top tables in the reception area, drinking champagne and exchanging exaggerated stories of their accomplishments since the last gathering. The Hayes family specialized in carefully crafted narratives of success, with any setbacks or struggles edited out as if they were shameful secrets. My mother spotted me first, waving with excessive enthusiasm from across the room. "Eliza, you're here!" She air-kissed both my cheeks, her perfume expensive and overwhelming. "Don't you look professional?" It wasn't the compliment she pretended it was, but I smiled anyway. "Thanks, Mom. Where's the guest of honor?" "Oh, Tyler's just arriving with Rebecca. They had to drop the kids with her parents." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They're trying for a third, you know. Tyler says they want a big family." Another achievement to celebrate. Another reminder of the life that came easier when you started without the weight of debt. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I nodded and moved away, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. I circulated through the room, exchanging pleasantries with relatives I saw once every few years, deflecting questions about my love life and accepting backhanded compliments about how dedicated I was to my little nursing job. Tyler arrived. With his wife, a flurry of greetings and hugs ensuing. He spotted me and broke into a genuine smile, crossing the room to pull me into a bear hug. "Sis, I wasn't sure you'd make it." I returned the hug stiffly. That was the complicated part. Tyler had always been affectionate, always seemed happy to see me. He either didn't see or chose not to acknowledge the fundamental unfairness that defined our relationship. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, the lie bitter on my tongue. "Did Mom tell you our news? We're trying for another baby." His face glowed with the easy happiness of someone who's never had to question his place in the world. She mentioned it. "Congratulations." "Yeah, the timing's perfect with the promotion. The salary bump means Rebecca can stay home with the kids indefinitely now. We're even looking at private schools already." Each casual mention of financial ease twisted the knife deeper. He had no idea what it was like to make different choices, to delay or abandon dreams because of money. He'd never had to. My father called for everyone's attention then, announcing that dinner would be served shortly. We moved into the banquet room, where assigned seating placed me between an elderly great-aunt who was partially deaf and a second cousin who wanted to talk about his cryptocurrency investments. Throughout the appetizer course, I half-listened to conversations around me, watching my parents beam with pride as various relatives congratulated them on Tyler's success. "You must have done something right," my father's golf buddy commented, clapping him on the shoulder. "Raising a son like that." As if they'd had nothing to do with creating the conditions for that success, as if he'd achieved everything through merit alone. By the time the main course arrived, I'd finished 2 glasses of champagne, not enough to blur my resolve, but enough to dull the edge of anxiety. My mother clinked her glass, calling for silence. "Before we continue our meal, I'd like to say a few words about why we've gathered today." She stood, resplendent in an expensive dress that probably cost more than a month of my rent. Family is the most important thing in this world. The Hayes family has always prioritized supporting each other, lifting each other up, celebrating each triumph as if it belongs to all of us. The irony was almost laughable. I took another sip of champagne. "Today we're especially proud to Celebrate Tyler's achievement. Making junior partner at Crawford and Beckman at just 30 is extraordinary. But we're not surprised, are we? Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Tyler has always been exceptional, and we've always known he was destined for greatness. My mother raised her glass higher. To Tyler, the pride of the Hayes family. Everyone raised their glasses, everyone except me. As the toast concluded and conversation resumed, I felt something shift inside me. Not the anger that had driven me here, but something clearer, calmer, a certainty that I would not leave this room without speaking my truth. I waded through the main course, through my father's story about Tyler's first mock trial victory in law school, through my aunt's questions about when I might find someone and settle down finally. When the servers began clearing plates in preparation for dessert, I knew my moment had arrived. I stood up, picking up my dessert spoon and tapping it against my water glass until the conversations around the table died away. 30 pairs of eyes turned to me with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. My mother's smile froze, her eyes communicating a clear message. What are you doing? This isn't on the agenda, but I was done following the family agenda. I'd like to make a toast as well, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. To equal opportunity. Something I never had in this family. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant clink of dishes from the kitchen. Eliza, my father said, a warning in his tone. This isn't the time or place. Actually, I think a family reunion is exactly the right time and place to discuss what family really means in the Hayes household. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the photos I'd taken in my father's study. I have some interesting documents to share with everyone. And that's when the real celebration began. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. I could almost hear the collective intake of breath, the mental calculations as relatives tried to determine if this was a joke or if they should begin making excuses to leave early. My mother's perfectly composed face crumpled for a fraction of a second before she recovered, social training kicking in. Eliza, sweetie, she said with a strained laugh, I think you've had a bit too much champagne. Why don't we talk about this later, in private? I've had 2 glasses, Mother. Less than you've had. I kept my voice level, refusing to give them any excuse to dismiss me as emotional or irrational. And no, we won't be discussing this in private. We've kept this private for 14 years. I'm done with privacy. I held up my phone, the screen displaying the first of the documents I'd photographed. These are the 529 college savings plans that were set up for Tyler and me when we were born. Identical contributions until I was 15. Then mine stopped completely while Tyler's continued to grow. I swiped to the next image. This is the statement from my plan the year I graduated high school, the year I was told there was, unfortunately, not enough money for my education. Another swipe. And this is Tyler's from the same year, with nearly 3 times the amount. My father stood now, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. That's enough, Eliza. You've taken private family documents. Documents that directly affected my life and my future, I interrupted, something I'd never dared do before. Documents that prove I was lied to. Documents that show I was forced to take on crushing debt while my brother was given every advantage. Tyler looked between our parents and me, genuine confusion on his face. What is she talking about? Mom? Dad? My mother placed a restraining hand on my father's arm. Eliza, this is hardly appropriate dinner conversation. You're embarrassing yourself and the family. No, what's embarrassing is treating your children unequally and then expecting the one you disadvantage to celebrate the other's success, as if we'd had the same opportunities. I turned to address the wider table. Did you all know that I just made my final student loan payment last month? 8 years of financial struggle that Tyler never had to experience. 8 years of compound interest that could have gone toward my own home, my own investments, my own future. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stared at their plates. Only my grandmother, my father's mother, met my gaze directly, something unreadable in her expression. "I don't understand," Tyler said, looking genuinely distressed. "Mom and Dad told me everyone's college fund had grown well. They never said." "Of course they didn't tell you," I replied, softening my tone slightly when addressing him. "They needed you to believe everything was fair and merit-based, that your success was entirely your own achievement, rather than partly the result of advantages I wasn't given." "That's not true," my father interjected. "We made decisions based on what was best for each of you. Tyler's career path required—" "Required what, Dad?" "A prestigious university, connections, freedom from financial stress, and mine didn't." The calm I'd maintained began to crack. "You decided when I was 15 that my future mattered less. Before I'd even chosen nursing as a career. Before either of us had shown what we were capable of." "We had limited resources," he insisted, though we all knew it wasn't true. "We had to make practical choices." "Limited resources?" I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "You bought a vacation property the year I started college. You renovated the kitchen that same year. You and Mom took a cruise to Alaska while I was working overnight shifts to afford textbooks." My Aunt Vivian, always one for drama, gasped audibly. My cousin Charlotte, who'd always been kind to me, looked horrified. Uncle Robert, my father's brother and business partner, studiously examined his dessert fork. "You could have gotten scholarships," my mother said weakly, "if you'd tried harder in high school. I had a 4.0 GPA. I was president of the student council. I volunteered at the hospital every weekend for 3 years." Each achievement recited like evidence in a trial, which in many ways this was. "I did get scholarships. They covered less than half the cost. Tyler had the same GPA I did, fewer extracurriculars, and you still paid his full ride." Tyler pushed back from the table, his face pale. "I didn't know," he said, looking at our parents. "You told me my college fund had just enough. You never said you were paying everything while Eliza was taking loans." The revelation that Tyler had been kept in the dark about the extent of the inequality hit me with unexpected force. I'd assumed all these years that he knew and simply accepted the preferential treatment as his due. The possibility that he had been misled, too, added another layer to my parents' deception. "Your father and I were doing what we thought best," my mother insisted, her composure finally cracking. "Eliza was always so independent, so capable. We knew she'd find a way. Tyler needed what? More support because he's a man? More investment because you valued his career path more? What exactly was the reasoning, Mom?" The questions I'd held back for years tumbled out, each one landing like a blow. My grandmother set down her water glass with deliberate precision, the sound cutting through the tension. "I'd like to hear the answer to that question as well, Diana," she said, addressing my mother with uncharacteristic sharpness. "Why exactly did one grandchild receive such different treatment than the other?" My mother faltered under my grandmother's scrutiny. "Margaret, surely you understand." In my generation," grandmother interrupted, "such blatant favoritism would have been considered shameful, regardless of gender, and to lie about it." She shook her head, disappointment evident in every line of her face. The support from an unexpected quarter bolstered my courage. "I don't need explanations anymore," I said, surprised to find it was true. "What's done is done. I paid my own way. I built my own life. I succeeded despite the obstacle you placed in my path." "Then why bring this up now?" my father demanded. "If you're so self-sufficient, why create this scene?" "Because the truth matters," I replied simply. "Because I'm tired of pretending our family is something it's not." because I refuse to keep showing up to celebrations of Tyler's accomplishments while mine go unacknowledged, because I won't be gaslit anymore about what really happened. I turned to face Tyler directly. I don't blame you for any of this. You didn't create the inequality, and it seems you didn't even know about it. But I need you to understand why. I can't keep pretending everything is fine between us. Why there will always be this distance that isn't your fault but isn't mine either. Tyler looked devastated, caught between loyalty to our parents and his evident shock at what had been revealed. Eliza, I swear I didn't know the full story. I always wondered how you were managing everything on your own, but when I asked, they said you were doing fine, that you preferred being independent. Of course they did. I felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for my brother. He too had been manipulated, though in a very different way. They needed you to believe that narrative to justify their choices. We did what we thought was right, my father insisted, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. For perhaps the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. No, I said quietly. You did what was easiest. What aligned with your biases? What served your preferences? And then you lied about it. To me, to Tyler, to yourselves. My mother dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, makeup perfectly preserved despite her apparent distress. We've always been proud of you, Eliza, of what you've accomplished, your resilience. My resilience was forced upon me by your choices. I cut in. Don't take credit for the strength I developed because you made my path harder than it needed to be. I gathered my purse and phone, tucking the evidence away. I didn't come here to ruin the celebration. I came to establish truth as the foundation for whatever relationship we have moving forward. I can't change the past. I can't get back the years I spent working double shifts while trying to complete my education. I can't recover the opportunities I missed or the stress I endured. I looked around the table at the stunned faces of my extended family, some showing sympathy, others discomfort, a few obvious disapproval. But I can change what happens next. I can decide what role this family plays in my life from this point forward. And I can refuse to participate in the fiction that we're all equally valued and supported. With that, I stepped away from the table, ready to leave a gathering I'd never wanted to attend in the first place. But Tyler stood quickly, blocking my path. Wait, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Don't go, not like this. I hesitated, caught off guard by the genuine distress in his expression. You said you don't blame me, he continued, but I blame myself for not seeing what was happening, for accepting everything I was given without questioning why you weren't receiving the same. That wasn't your responsibility, I said. You were 18, focused on your own future, as you should have been. Maybe not then, he conceded. But what about later, when I graduated debt-free while you were still working through school? When they helped with my down payment while you were living with roommates? I never questioned any of it. I just accepted the advantages as if I deserved them more than you did. His self-recrimination was unexpected, and I found myself in the strange position of comforting the person who had benefited from my disadvantage. You're not responsible for their decisions, Tyler. No, but I am responsible for my own blindness. He turned to face our parents. And I'm responsible for what I do now that I know the truth. My father made a placating gesture. Son, this isn't the time. When is the time, Dad? Tyler's voice rose with uncharacteristic sharpness. When were you planning to tell me that my success was built partly on my sister's sacrifice? That the playing field wasn't level? That, while I was studying abroad in Madrid, Eliza was working overnight shifts to afford basic textbooks? The shocked murmurs around the table grew louder. This public unveiling of family secrets was unprecedented in the carefully curated world of Hayes family gatherings. Tyler, please, my mother pleaded. We can discuss this privately. No, Mom, that's exactly the problem. Everything is kept private, hidden, brushed under expensive rugs. Tyler's face flushed with anger that mirrored my own long-suppressed feelings. I've spent my entire adult life believing I earned everything through merit alone, never questioning why Eliza struggled while I thrived. Do you have any idea what that realization does to my perception of myself? Of you? My brother's unexpected alliance created a seismic shift in the family dynamic. For the first time, I wasn't the outsider standing alone against a united front. The crack in the family facade was widening, revealing structural problems that could no longer be ignored. We made the best decisions we could with the resources we had, my father insisted, but the excuse sounded hollow even to my ears. That's a lie, Dad. Tyler's bluntness shocked everyone, including me. My diplomatic brother had always been the peacemaker, smoothing over conflicts rather than creating them. You had the resources. You chose how to allocate them. You decided one child deserved investment and the other didn't. The naked truth, spoken by the golden child himself, landed with devastating impact. My father seemed to physically shrink. In his chair, the confident posture of authority suddenly abandoned. It wasn't like that, my mother whispered, but her protest lacked conviction. Then what was it like? I asked, finding new strength in Tyler's unexpected support. Explain to me, to both of us, why you made these choices. Not with excuses about limited resources or vague references to different career paths. The real reason. The silence stretched uncomfortably as my parents exchanged glances, a wordless communication I'd witnessed throughout my childhood whenever difficult topics arose. Finally, my father spoke, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. The truth is, we always saw Tyler following in my footsteps, continuing the family legacy in a prestigious profession. We saw his future as an extension of our own achievements. He couldn't quite meet my eyes. Your interests were always different, Eliza. More independent. Less traditional. Less valuable, you mean, I translated. He didn't deny it. Couldn't deny it. The truth, finally spoken aloud, hung in the air between us. I never wanted to follow in your footsteps, Dad, Tyler said quietly. I became a lawyer because you and Mom pushed me in that direction from the time I was in middle school. Because it was the path of least resistance. Because it made you proud. This revelation caught me off guard. In my narrative of our lives, Tyler had always been the willing inheritor of parental expectations, eagerly embracing the path laid out for him. The possibility that he too had been manipulated, if in a very different way, had never occurred to me. You're a successful lawyer, my father protested. A junior partner already. You have a beautiful family, a nice home. And a sister who can barely look me in the eye because of the unfair advantage you gave me. Tyler's voice cracked with emotion. Was that part of your plan for my successful life? My grandmother, who had been watching the exchange with keen interest, dabbed her lips with her napkin and pushed back from the table. I believe this conversation is long overdue, but perhaps not suited for the entire extended family's participation. She fixed my parents with a stern look. Diana Frank, I suggest you continue this discussion with your children somewhere private. The rest of us should give them space. Her pronouncement, delivered with the quiet authority that had always commanded respect in our family, broke the tableau. Various relatives began murmuring excuses, gathering purses and jackets, making hasty exits with backward glances of curiosity and concern. Within minutes, the banquet room had cleared except for my parents, Tyler, his wife Rebecca, who had remained silent throughout, but whose hand had tightly gripped Tyler's under the table. And me. And, surprisingly, my grandmother, who showed no intention of leaving despite her own suggestion. You too, Mother, my father said, clearly uncomfortable with her continued presence. I think not, she replied calmly. I've sat back and watched. Far too much already. I won't be excluded from the reckoning. Something in her tone suggested she had suspicions, or perhaps even knowledge of what had happened all those years ago. I'd always seen my grandmother as part of the family power structure, aligned with my parents' values and decisions. The possibility that she might be an ally was both confusing and oddly comforting. With the audience gone, my father's demeanor shifted from defensive to defeated. He loosened his tie and sank back into his chair. "What do you want from us, Eliza? An apology? Money? What will it take to put this behind us?" The question revealed so much about his worldview, that emotional wounds could be resolved through transaction. That acknowledgement of harm was a negotiation rather than a moral imperative. "I want you to understand what you did," I replied, taking my seat again. Not just the financial impact, which was significant, but the emotional one. Do you have any idea what it's like to know your parents decided you were less worthy of investment than your sibling? To work yourself to exhaustion, while watching your brother receive effortless support? To achieve success not because of your family but despite them? My mother's eyes filled with tears that, for once, seemed genuine rather than performative. "We never meant to hurt you, Eliza. We thought you were strong enough to handle it. We thought you'd be fine." "That's not good enough, Mom," Tyler said, before I could respond. Being strong enough to handle it doesn't mean she should have had to. And the fact that you knew she was strong enough but still struggling and did nothing, that makes it worse, not better. The role reversal, Tyler. Advocating for me while I sat in stunned silence was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. All these years, I'd cast him as an unwitting beneficiary at best, an entitled participant at worst. I'd never considered him a potential ally in holding our parents accountable. "What would you have us do?" my father asked, spreading his hands, in a gesture of helplessness that seemed entirely foreign on him. "We can't change the past." "No," I agreed. "You can't. But you can acknowledge it honestly. You can stop pretending our achievements exist in a vacuum, unaffected by the advantages given or withheld. You can recognize that Tyler's success, while partly due to his own efforts, was facilitated by opportunities I had to fight for on my own. And you can make amends," Tyler added firmly, "not just with words, but with actions." My parents exchanged another of their loaded glances. "What kind of amends?" my father asked cautiously. I hadn't come with a list of demands. The confrontation itself had been my only clear objective, but Tyler seemed to have ideas already forming. "First, you need to calculate exactly how much Eliza paid in student loans, principal and interest." His lawyer's precision emerged as he outlined terms like a settlement negotiation. "Then you need to acknowledge that while you couldn't go back in time to pay her tuition directly, you could have helped her with those loans at any point in the past 8 years. You chose not to." My mother looked stricken. "We offered to help with the down payment on a condo last year. After you'd already given me 3 times that amount for my house," Tyler countered. "That wasn't equity, Mom. That was a token gesture designed to alleviate your guilt while maintaining the imbalance." I watched my brother with growing amazement. He was articulating injustices I'd felt but never expected him to recognize, much less advocate against. "Whatever the amount of Eliza's loans," he continued, "that figure needs to be matched and provided to her, not as a loan, not as a gift with strings attached, but as delayed payment of the educational support she should have received originally." My father's face tightened. "That's a substantial sum." "Yes," Tyler agreed without sympathy. "Financial inequality usually is." My grandmother, who had been listening intently, nodded with approval. "Frank, you know he's right. You and Diana created this situation. You have the means to address it, at least financially. And beyond the money," I found my voice again, "I need acknowledgement. Real acknowledgement, not just private admissions, but public recognition of what happened. No more family mythology about how we were treated equally or how I chose a more practical path. No more celebrations where Tyler's achievements are centered while mine are footnotes. "What do you want? A party for paying off your student loans?" my father asked, a flash of his usual dismissiveness breaking through. "Yes," I said simply. That would have been appropriate. That was an achievement equal to or greater than Tyler making junior partner, given the obstacles I faced. But it's not about parties, Dad. It's about recognition. It's about being seen accurately rather than through the distorted lens of your preferences and biases. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, my father really looked at me. Not as his daughter who had disappointed by choosing the wrong career path or failed by remaining single at 32, but as a person who had overcome significant challenges to build a life on her own terms. "You're right," he said finally, the admission clearly difficult for him. "We treated you unfairly. We justified it with rationalizations about different paths and different needs, but the truth is, we invested more in Tyler's future than in yours. We were wrong to do that, and we were wrong to lie about it afterward." The acknowledgement, so long awaited, landed with unexpected emotional impact. I felt tears threatening and blinked them back, determined to maintain composure until this conversation concluded. "I'm sorry, Eliza," my mother added, reaching across the table as if to take my hand before thinking better of it. "Sorry doesn't change what happened. I know that. But I am truly sorry. Not just for the financial disparity, but for dismissing your achievements, for not celebrating your successes with the same enthusiasm we showed for Tyler's." Their apologies were a beginning, not an end. Trust broken over decades wouldn't be restored in a single conversation. Patterns established throughout my lifetime wouldn't be dismantled in an evening. But it was a start, the first crack in a facade of family mythology that had constrained and diminished me for too long. "I need time," I said finally. "Time to process this conversation. Time to decide what kind of relationship I want with you moving forward. The financial amends Tyler suggested are appropriate, but money doesn't fix the underlying issue." "Which is?" my father asked, seeming genuinely uncertain. "Respect," I replied simply. "Equal respect for my choices, my path, my achievements. Not grudging acknowledgement, but genuine recognition of my worth, not as measured against Tyler's life or your expectations, but on its own terms." My grandmother nodded approvingly. "Well said." Tyler reached across the table, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, I took it. "I want to make this right, too," he said. "I've benefited from inequality I didn't even fully recognize. That stops now." For the first time since arriving at the reunion, I felt something other than anger or resentment, a cautious hope that perhaps from the ashes of exposed truths, something healthier might eventually emerge. "This isn't resolved," I said, looking from Tyler to my parents. "One conversation doesn't erase years of inequality, but it's a beginning." I stood again, gathering my belongings with steady hands. This time, no one tried to stop me. "I'm going home now. I need space to think about what happens next. When I'm ready, I'll be in touch to discuss the financial amends and what our relationship looks like moving forward." My father looked as though he wanted to object to the open-ended nature of this resolution, but my mother placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Take whatever time you need, Eliza. We'll be here when you're ready." As I walked toward the door, Tyler called after me. "Sis, for what it's worth, I've always admired you, more than you know. What you've accomplished despite everything. It's extraordinary." I turned back, meeting his gaze. "It shouldn't have had to be extraordinary, Tyler. That's the point. I should have had the same foundation you did." "I know," he acknowledged. "And I promise you, things will be different going forward." With that provisional promise hanging in the air, I left the banquet room, walking with measured steps through the country club's hushed corridor. Outside, the evening air felt cleaner somehow, as if the truth-telling had cleared away years of accumulated toxicity. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of unspoken resentment. The inequality hadn't been erased. The years of struggle couldn't be undone, but the lies had been exposed. The truth was finally acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement lay the seeds of something I hadn't expected to find at a Hayes family reunion: liberation. As I drove away from the country club, I realized that the confrontation hadn't been about punishing my parents or embarrassing the family. It had been about reclaiming my narrative, refusing to participate any longer in a story that diminished my worth and erased my struggles. It had been about setting terms for my continued presence in their lives, rather than accepting whatever scraps of attention and respect they deigned to offer. The road ahead was uncertain. Relationships built on decades of inequality and deception couldn't be transformed overnight. Trust, once broken, required more than apologies to restore. But for the first time, I was approaching that future from a position of truth rather than pretense, of strength rather than accommodation. The revelation at the Hayes family reunion hadn't just changed my relationship with my parents and brother. It had changed my relationship with myself. No longer the perpetual outsider seeking validation from those who had systematically undervalued me, I was now the author of my own story. A story of resilience, yes, but also of courage. The courage to speak truth to power, even when that power was wrapped in the complex bonds of family. The weeks following the family reunion unfolded in a strange, suspended state. I returned to my apartment that night feeling simultaneously drained and energized, as if I'd shed a weight I'd carried. For so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. Sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the confrontation in endless variations, sometimes with sharper retorts I wished I'd delivered, sometimes with the stunned expressions of relatives I hadn't even realized were watching me with newfound respect. The first text came from Tyler at 6:42 the next morning. "Can we talk? Just us." I waited until noon to respond, using the morning to center myself, to establish boundaries even in this new landscape of acknowledged truth. "Not yet. I need time." His reply was immediate. "I understand. When you're ready." My phone remained conspicuously silent from my parents' end. No calls, no texts, no emails attempting to control the narrative or minimize what had happened. Their silence was unprecedented. Throughout my adult life, family conflicts had followed a predictable pattern. My mother calling with tearful reconciliation attempts, my father sending terse messages that framed disagreements as misunderstandings, both working in tandem to restore the facade of Hayes family harmony as quickly as possible. This silence suggested the confrontation had landed differently than previous conflicts. They weren't rushing to patch over the cracks. Perhaps they couldn't. I returned to work on Monday, moving through my shifts at the hospital with a strange new clarity. For years, I'd pushed myself to exhaustion, taking extra shifts, volunteering for the most challenging cases, pursuing additional certifications, all to prove my worth, to demonstrate that I'd succeeded despite the obstacles they'd placed in my path. Now, I found myself questioning that driving motivation. If I no longer needed to prove anything to them, what kind of nurse did I want to be? What kind of life did I want to build? On Wednesday evening, an unexpected email arrived from my grandmother. The subject line read simply, "Long overdue." "Eliza, I've been reflecting on what transpired at the reunion. Your courage in speaking truth that has too long remained buried has stirred something in me as well. I was complicit in my silence over the years, watching the disparity in how you and Tyler were treated without intervening as I should have. There are things you don't know about our family history, patterns that repeat when not consciously broken. Your grandfather and I made similar mistakes with your father and his sister, your Aunt Patricia. Perhaps you've wondered why she lives across the country and visits so rarely. The reasons echo your own experience more than you know. I would like to speak with you, if you're willing. Not to make excuses for your parents or myself, but to provide context that might help you make sense of what happened and decide how to move forward. You've always reminded me of Patricia, the same resilience, the same clear-eyed determination. She found her path despite the disadvantages we placed in her way. You've done the same. I am prouder of that strength than I can express, even as I regret the circumstances that forced you to develop it. Take all the time you need. I will be here when you're ready. With love and admiration, Grandmother Margaret. The email left me, stunned, opening doors of understanding I hadn't known existed. I'd always seen my quiet, proper grandmother as an extension of my parents' value system, a woman who prioritized appearances and achievement in the traditional Hayes family mold. The possibility that she carried her own regrets, her own understanding of the dynamics I'd experienced shifted my perception of our family history entirely. Aunt Patricia had always been a peripheral figure in my life, the distant relative who sent thoughtful but impersonal gifts at Christmas, who made brief appearances at major family events before disappearing back to her life in Seattle. I'd attributed her distance to geographic separation and different interests. Never once had I considered that her relationship with my father and grandparents might mirror my own experience of familial inequality. I didn't respond to my grandmother immediately. This new information required integration, consideration, of how it might change my understanding not just of my own story, but of the generational patterns that had shaped it. 2 weeks after the reunion, the financial amends Tyler had suggested arrived in the form of a wire transfer to my account. The amount matched exactly what I'd paid in student loans over 8 years, principal and interest combined. There was no accompanying message from my parents, no conditions or expectations attached, just the money I should have had from the beginning delivered 14 years too late. The sum was significant, enough to fundamentally change my financial situation. Enough for a substantial down payment on a home in a neighborhood my mother wouldn't describe as transitional. Enough to take an extended sabbatical if I chose. Enough to fund additional education or training without the specter of new debt. Yet its arrival provoked more complex emotions than the relief or vindication I might have expected. The money couldn't undo the years of struggle. It couldn't restore lost opportunities or erase the psychological impact of knowing I'd been deemed less worthy of investment than my brother. It was simultaneously too little and too late, yet also more than I'd ever expected to receive. I left the money untouched in a separate savings account, unwilling to make immediate decisions about its use. This wasn't a windfall or a gift. It was delayed justice, and it deserved thoughtful consideration. A month after the reunion, I finally agreed to meet Tyler for coffee at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between his suburban home and my city apartment. He arrived early, already seated at a corner table when I walked in, his usual confident posture replaced by an uncharacteristic tension. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down, pushing a cappuccino toward me. "I remembered your order." "Thanks." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, studying my brother's face. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion I recognized from my own mirror on particularly difficult days. "How are things at home?" He gave a humorless laugh. "Complicated. Rebecca and I have had some intense conversations about all this. She's furious with Mom and Dad. Feels betrayed that they presented themselves as equally supportive of both their children when that wasn't remotely true. And you? How are you feeling?" Tyler stared into his coffee for a long moment. Confused, angry, ashamed, questioning everything about my life and success. He looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "I've spent 15 years building a career and identity on a foundation I thought was solid. Now I realize it was built partly on your disadvantage. It's destabilizing. His vulnerability surprised me. My brother had always projected certainty, confidence in his place in the world and his right to occupy it. Seeing him genuinely grappling with his unearned advantages stirred unexpected compassion. "Your success is still your own," I said carefully. "You worked hard, made good choices with the opportunities you were given." "Opportunities you should have had, too," he countered. "That's what keeps me awake at night, Eliza. Thinking about the parallel universe where we both started from the same position. Where would you be now if you hadn't spent those years working double shifts? If you'd been able to take the internships I took, attend the conferences I attended, build professional networks without the constant pressure of debt?" It was a question I'd asked myself countless times, usually in the darkest hours of night shifts or in moments of exhaustion when the inequality felt most acute. Hearing it from Tyler's lips was validating in a way I hadn't anticipated. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe I'd be in a different position at the hospital. Maybe I'd have pursued advanced practice nursing sooner. Maybe I'd own a home instead of renting. Or maybe I'd be exactly where I am now, just with less stress and struggle along the way." "Do you ever regret nursing?" he asked, the question tentative. "Ever wonder if you'd have chosen differently without the financial constraints?" I considered this carefully. Sometimes I wonder if I would have explored more options, taken more time to decide. But no, I don't regret nursing itself. It's challenging, meaningful work that suits me. The irony is that Mom and Dad framed it as the practical choice, less prestigious than law or medicine, but it's actually aligned perfectly with what matters most to me: direct impact on people's lives at critical moments. Tyler nodded, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "You were always the one who knew exactly who you were. I envied that certainty, even as a kid. I followed the path of least resistance, the one that earned the most approval." This revelation of my brother's inner experience, so at odds with how I'd perceived him, opened yet another door of understanding. While I'd been fighting for recognition and support, he'd been conforming to expectations that perhaps didn't align with his authentic self. Different struggles, both shaped by the same parental dynamics. "Are you unhappy being a lawyer?" I asked, realizing I'd never actually posed this fundamental question to my brother. He hesitated. "Not unhappy exactly. I'm good at it. The work is intellectually stimulating. The compensation is excellent." He sighed deeply. "But if I'm being honest, I don't feel the kind of passion or purpose you've always had. I see how you talk about nursing, the way your whole face lights up when you describe helping a patient through a crisis, and I realize I've never felt that way about corporate law. What would you have chosen if you'd been truly free to decide?" "Architecture," he said without hesitation, as if the answer had been waiting just below the surface for years. I've always been fascinated by the way physical spaces affect human experience, how design shapes interaction and emotion. But Dad dismissed it as an impractical hobby when I mentioned it in high school. I remembered now Tyler's detailed sketches of buildings, the architectural magazines he'd collected, the way he'd talk enthusiastically about famous structures we saw on family vacations. Those interests had disappeared so gradually I hadn't noticed their absence until this moment. "It's not too late, you know," I said softly. "You're only 30. People change careers at 40, 50, even older." He gave me a rueful smile. "With a mortgage, 2 kids, and a third on the way? The golden handcuffs are pretty tight at this point." "Maybe not a complete career change," I acknowledged. "But perhaps there are ways to incorporate that passion into your life. Pro bono work for design-focused nonprofits, evening classes in architectural theory, smaller shifts that keep your financial stability while making space for what truly engages you." Tyler looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "How are you being so generous with me right now, after everything that happened?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" I mean, you have every right to be furious with me. To hold me accountable for benefiting from inequality for 15 years without questioning it. To resent my advantages and success. Instead, you're helping me consider my own fulfillment. It's what family should actually look like, I finished for him. Supporting each other's authentic development rather than imposing external expectations or creating artificial competition. He nodded slowly. The morning after the reunion, I told Rebecca I felt like I was seeing clearly for the first time, both our family dynamics and my own life choices. It's terrifying and liberating at the same time. "Welcome to my world," I said with a small laugh. I've been having that dual terror and liberation for weeks now. Our conversation shifted then, becoming more fluid, more honest than any we'd had in our adult lives. We talked about our childhood perceptions of each other, how I'd seen him as the golden child, effortlessly collecting parental approval, while he'd seen me as the brave rebel, defining my own path. We discussed our parents' reaction to the confrontation, comparing notes on their separate conversations with each of us in the aftermath. "They're genuinely shaken," Tyler reported. "I've never seen Dad so subdued. Mom keeps trying to find ways to make it right beyond the money, but she doesn't know how. They've constructed their entire identities around certain narratives about themselves as parents, as people. Having those narratives exposed as harmful fictions has left them untethered." "Have they reached out to you directly?" he asked, after a pause. "No," I replied. "Just the wire transfer. No message, no conditions." "They're afraid," he said simply. "Afraid of saying the wrong thing, making it worse. Afraid you won't forgive them. Afraid of who they are if they're not the good parents they believed themselves to be. Their fear isn't my responsibility," I said, surprising myself with the clarity of this boundary. "No, it's not," Tyler agreed immediately. "You don't owe them absolution or easy reconciliation. I just thought you should know where things stand, from their perspective." As our coffee cups emptied, I found myself sharing my grandmother's email, watching Tyler's expression shift from surprise to thoughtful consideration. "I had no idea about Aunt Patricia," he said when I finished. "Though, it explains a lot about her distance from the family. I'm considering reaching out to her," I admitted. "After I speak with grandmother, I feel like understanding the generational patterns might help me process my own experience." Tyler nodded. "That makes sense. If you do connect with her, would you let me know what you learn? I'm trying to understand our family better too, to make sure I don't perpetuate harmful patterns with my own kids." The request, made with genuine humility, touched me unexpectedly. "Yes, I'll share what I learn, and Tyler. Thank you for being willing to see the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. That's more than our parents managed for decades." As we parted outside the cafe, Tyler hesitated before asking, "Can we do this again? Talk like this, I mean. I'd like to have a relationship with my sister that isn't built on pretense or inequality." "I'd like that too," I said, surprised to find I meant it. "It might take time to build something new, but I'm willing to try if you are." His relief was palpable. "I am. Very much so." The following week, I drove to my grandmother's home, in the affluent suburb where she'd lived since my grandfather's death a decade earlier. The elegant townhouse was immaculate as always, tastefully decorated with antiques and art collected over decades of privileged living. But I saw it with new eyes now, recognizing the careful curation of appearances that had shaped our family culture for generations. Grandmother Margaret welcomed me with a reserved warmth typical of her generation, leading me to her sunroom where tea was already arranged on a small table. At 82, she remained remarkably sharp, her posture straight, her silver hair perfectly styled, her eyes missing nothing. "Thank you for coming, Eliza," she said as we settled into comfortable chairs. "And thank you for your courage at the reunion. It was long overdue. You mentioned similarities between my experience and Aunt Patricia's, I said, bypassing small talk in favor of the conversation's true purpose. My grandmother nodded, her expression somber. Your grandfather and I made choices very similar to what your parents did with you and Tyler. We had 2 children, your father Frank and his sister Patricia, 4 years his junior. When college approached for Frank, we invested heavily in his education, paying for an Ivy League degree and law school afterward. She poured tea with steady hands, the familiar ritual providing structure for difficult revelations. When Patricia's turn came, we told her we had limited resources, that she would need to find scholarships or attend a less expensive school. The truth was that we simply valued your father's education and career trajectory more highly. He was the son, the one who would carry on the family name and legacy. The parallel was so exact it was almost eerie. Did you ever acknowledge the inequality to Aunt Patricia? Not until many years later, my grandmother admitted, regret evident in her voice. By then, the damage was done. She'd built her life with minimal contact or support from us. When your grandfather and I finally tried to make amends, financially and emotionally, she accepted the money but maintained her distance. Some wounds don't heal completely, especially when they're inflicted by those who should have provided protection rather than harm. She set down her teacup with a soft clink. Patricia has had a successful life by any measure. She built a thriving business, married a kind man, raised 2 children who adore her. But our relationship never recovered the closeness it might have had. That is my greatest regret. The connection lost because of choices made from outdated values and unconscious biases. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why not years ago, when you saw the pattern repeating with me? My grandmother's composure cracked slightly, genuine emotion breaking through her careful dignity. Fear, cowardice, unwillingness to confront my own past mistakes. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in your parents' decisions about their children. I rationalized that times had changed, that the inequality couldn't be as damaging to you as it had been to Patricia, in an era with fewer opportunities for women. She reached across the table to cover my hand with her own. But the truth, which I'm only now finding the courage to admit, is that acknowledging the harm done to you would have meant fully acknowledging the harm I did to Patricia. And I wasn't ready to face that accountability. The honesty of her admission was both painful and oddly healing. This wasn't just about my parents' choices anymore. It was about generational patterns, unconscious biases passed down through family systems, harm perpetuated not always from malice, but from unexamined values and unwillingness to change. It stops with me, I said firmly. This pattern of treating children unequally based on gender or conformity to expectations, it ends in our family with my generation. Yes, my grandmother agreed, a hint of pride in her voice. That's why your stand at the reunion was so important, not just for your own healing, but for breaking a cycle that has caused harm across generations. We talked for hours that afternoon, my grandmother sharing stories about Patricia's youth, her own upbringing in a family where sons were prized above daughters, the gradual evolution of her understanding as the world changed around her. For the first time, I saw her not just as my father's mother or as the family matriarch, but as a woman shaped by her own history, capable of both harmful choices and genuine growth. Before I left, she handed me a sealed envelope. Patricia's contact information, she explained. She would welcome hearing from you, I think. Your stories might bring mutual understanding neither of you has found elsewhere. I took the envelope, another piece of the puzzle I was slowly assembling, not just of my own experience, but of the larger family dynamics that had shaped it. The drive home from my grandmother's house felt different from the journey there. I was carrying new information, new perspectives that expanded my understanding beyond the personal hurt I'd experienced to a broader view of intergenerational patterns. This didn't excuse what my parents had done, but it provided context that helped me see their actions as part of something larger than individual malice or preference. That evening, I finally opened the email that had been sitting in my drafts folder for weeks, a response to my parents. It wasn't an absolution or an easy reconciliation. It was a careful delineation of what I needed for any relationship moving forward. Full acknowledgement of past inequalities without minimization or excuse. Respect for my career, choices, and achievements on their own terms. And time and space to rebuild trust that had been fundamentally broken. I included an invitation to meet in person once they had considered these requirements, not at their home or mine, but on neutral ground where we could begin the slow work of establishing a new relationship based on truth rather than comforting fictions. As I pressed send, I felt neither triumph nor anxiety, but a quiet certainty that I was charting a path forward based on self-respect and clear boundaries, rather than the desperate need for approval that had characterized so much of my earlier life. The money from my parents remained in its separate account, still awaiting my decision. But in the weeks since the confrontation, my relationship with money itself had begun to shift, where once I'd seen it primarily as security, protection against vulnerability like I'd experienced in college, I now allowed myself to consider it as potential, funds that could expand my choices rather than just prevent worst-case scenarios. I began researching advanced nursing degrees, exploring specialized training that had previously seemed financially out of reach. I looked at condos in neighborhoods I actually wanted to live in rather than areas chosen purely for affordability. I allowed myself to consider sabbatical options that would provide time for reflection and renewal after years of unrelenting work. These explorations weren't about spending the money immediately, but about expanding my sense of possibility, recognizing that the constraints I'd lived with for so long were loosening. Financial freedom wouldn't erase the past inequality, but it could help shape a future with fewer artificial limitations. 3 months after the family reunion, I sat in my apartment completing an application for a nurse practitioner program I'd long been interested in, but had postponed due to financial constraints. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, Aunt Patricia's, name appearing on the screen. We'd exchanged several long emails since my conversation with my grandmother, each message revealing more similarities in our experiences and approaches to family dynamics. "I just wanted to check in before your meeting with Frank and Diana tomorrow," she said when I answered, her voice warm despite the physical distance between us. "How are you feeling about it?" "Centered," I replied after considering the question. Not expecting miraculous transformation, but open to whatever authentic connection is possible now that the truth is acknowledged. "That's the healthiest approach," she affirmed. "I wish I'd had your clarity when I was your age. It took me much longer to establish those boundaries." "I had the advantage of your precedent," I reminded her. "Knowing your story helped me understand mine wasn't unique or my fault." "That's why sharing these experiences matters," Patricia said. "It breaks the isolation that makes us question our own perceptions and worth." After we hung up, I returned to my application with renewed purpose. Whatever happened with my parents tomorrow, whether they were capable of the genuine acknowledgement and change I'd requested or not, my path forward was becoming increasingly clear. It would be built on truth, on boundaries that protected my well-being, on choices made from authentic desires rather than reaction to past wounds. The family reunion confrontation hadn't just been about exposing long-buried inequality. It had been the catalyst for a profound shift in how I understood myself and my place in the world. Not as the daughter who had to prove her worth through endless achievement and self-sacrifice, but as a woman claiming her rightful place, her full value, regardless of others' ability to recognize it. As I submitted the application and closed my laptop, I felt a sense of quiet certainty. The journey ahead would have its challenges, its moments of doubt and difficulty. Transformed family relationships required ongoing work from all involved, not just a single moment of revelation. Financial freedom brought new decisions, new responsibilities to manage. Professional growth would demand commitment and adaptation. But for perhaps the first time, I was moving toward this future unburdened by the weight of unacknowledged truth, undefined by others' limited vision of my worth, undiminished by comparison to paths made deliberately easier for someone else. The most valuable outcome of the family reunion hadn't been the monetary amends, important as those were. It had been the reclamation of my narrative, the right to define my own success, to acknowledge both the injustice I'd experienced and the strength I'd developed in response, to set terms for continuing relationships rather than accepting whatever was offered. That reclamation was beyond price. It was the foundation upon which everything else could now be built, not in reaction to the past, but in authentic creation of the future I chose for myself. I chose a quiet bistro downtown for the meeting with my parents, neutral territory, with enough ambient noise for privacy, but public enough to discourage emotional outbursts. I arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner table and ordering a sparkling water to sip while I gathered my thoughts. The past 3 months had changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. The constant background hum of resentment that had accompanied family interactions for years had quieted, replaced not by forgiveness exactly, but by something more nuanced, a clear-eyed understanding of how our family dynamics had developed, and my own power to redefine them moving forward. My correspondence with Aunt Patricia had been particularly transformative. Her story, so eerily similar to mine despite the decades between them, had helped me contextualize my experience as part of a larger pattern rather than a personal rejection. The day I stopped needing my parents' approval was the day I truly became an adult, she'd written in one email. Not at 18 or 21, but at 36, when I finally understood that their limited vision of my worth didn't have to become my own. I spotted my parents the moment they entered the bistro. They looked different somehow. My father, less commanding in his posture, my mother's usual perfect composure showing slight cracks around the edges. They scanned the room, and when their eyes found me, I saw an unfamiliar hesitation in their approach. "Eliza," my mother said as they reached the table, her hand half extending for a hug before dropping uncertainly to her side. "Thank you for suggesting we meet." I nodded, gesturing to the chairs across from me. "Thank you for coming." They settled themselves, the awkwardness between us palpable. In all our previous conflicts, they had arrived with a clear strategy: my mother's emotional appeals, my father's authoritative pronouncements, their united front designed to bring me back into compliance with family expectations. Today, they seemed unscripted, uncertain of their roles in this new landscape where old patterns had been irrevocably disrupted. A server appeared to take their drink orders, providing a momentary reprieve from the tension. When she departed, my father cleared his throat. "We received your email," he began, his usual confident tone subdued. "Your requirements for moving forward." "And?" I prompted when he didn't continue. My mother stepped in. "We've been doing a lot of thinking, Eliza, about our choices, about how we treated you compared to Tyler." Her perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with her napkin. "It hasn't been easy, confronting the truth about our own behavior." "I imagine not," I said, neither accusatory nor sympathetic, simply acknowledging. "We spoke with your grandmother," my father added, surprising me, "and with Patricia." This I hadn't expected. My father and his sister had maintained such a careful distance for decades that I'd assumed they barely communicated beyond obligatory holiday greetings. Patricia was direct about her experience, he continued, discomfort evident in his expression. About the parallels between how our parents treated us and how we treated you and Tyler. It was illuminating. "And difficult to hear," my mother interjected. "But necessary. We needed to understand the pattern we were perpetuating without even realizing it." A small ember of hope kindled in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. Understanding the pattern is important, I agreed. But recognizing a pattern isn't the same as taking responsibility for your specific choices within it. My father nodded slowly, seeming to steel himself for what came next. You're right. While the generational context helps explain our behavior, it doesn't excuse it. He met my eyes directly for what felt like the first time in years, not looking past me or through me, but truly seeing me. We deliberately advantaged Tyler over you. We lied about the financial circumstances to justify that decision. We valued his educational and career path more highly than yours, based on outdated biases about gender and prestige. And when you succeeded despite these obstacles, we took credit for your resilience, rather than acknowledging our role in making your path unnecessarily difficult. The forthright acknowledgement, delivered without defensiveness or qualification, momentarily stunned me. I'd prepared for partial admissions, for subtle deflections, for the familiar dance of parental justification. This unflinching accountability was unprecedented. And beyond the financial inequality, my mother continued when I didn't immediately respond, we failed to celebrate your achievements with the same enthusiasm we showed for Tyler's. We minimized your successes and overlooked the exceptional determination it took to accomplish what you have despite the disadvantages we created. She reached into her purse and removed an envelope, placing it on the table between us. Inside is a formal acknowledgement of the financial advantages we provided to Tyler but denied to you. The wire transfer we sent previously matched the amount of your student loans, but it doesn't account for the lost opportunity costs, what those funds might have grown to if you'd been able to invest them instead of servicing debt, the career, opportunities you might have pursued with more financial freedom, the quality of life differences during those formative years. I made no move to take the envelope. Financial amends are important, I said carefully, but they don't address the emotional impact of knowing your parents saw you as less worthy of investment than your brother. No amount of money can address that, my father agreed, surprising me again with his candor. That harm can only be addressed through changed behavior moving forward, consistent respect for your choices and achievements, genuine celebration of your successes, and careful examination of our own biases before they manifest in further inequitable treatment. The server returned with their drinks and to take our food orders. The interruption gave me a moment to process what was happening. My parents' responses went beyond what I'd expected or demanded. They suggested not just reluctant compliance with my terms for reconciliation, but genuine reflection and commitment to change. Once our orders were placed and we were alone again, my mother spoke, her voice quieter than before. We've also been in family therapy, she admitted, color rising in her cheeks at this confession of what she'd always considered weakness. Separately from our conversations with Patricia and Margaret, we recognized that our patterns run deep and that we needed professional help to understand and change them. That's significant, I said, genuinely impressed by this step so contrary to their usual self-sufficiency. It's been enlightening, my father said, a hint of his old certainty returning, but directed now at his own growth rather than at controlling others. Uncomfortable, but necessary. We've begun to understand how our own upbringings shaped our values and biases, how we unconsciously perpetuated harmful patterns while believing we were making rational decisions in everyone's best interest. Including yours, my mother added. We genuinely believed we were doing right by you, Eliza. Not because you mattered less, but because we saw you as stronger, more independent, more capable of success without support. She shook her head, remorse evident. It was a convenient fiction that allowed us to direct resources toward Tyler while telling ourselves we were recognizing your superior resilience rather than burdening you unfairly. Their honesty was disarming, creating space for my own. The worst part wasn't the financial struggle, I admitted. It was knowing you saw my brother's future as more valuable than mine. That no matter what I achieved, it would never quite measure up in your eyes because of choices made when I was still a teenager. My father winced visibly at this, the impact of my words registering in a way they might not have before the confrontation at the reunion. "You're right," he said simply, "and there's no justification for that bias. All we can do now is acknowledge it, work to eliminate it from our thinking moving forward, and make whatever amends you'll accept." Our food arrived, creating another pause in the conversation. As we began eating, the atmosphere shifted subtly from the tense confrontation I'd anticipated to something more thoughtful. Three adults genuinely trying to understand each other across the divide of past harm and present accountability. "I've been in contact with Aunt Patricia," I said after a few bites. "Her perspective has been valuable, both on our family dynamics and on how to move forward without carrying resentment as a permanent burden." My father's expression tightened. Briefly at the mention of his sister, old discomfort evident. "Patricia has every right to her feelings about how our parents treated us differently, and every right to keep her distance, as you do." He set down his fork, seeming to choose his next words with care. "But I hope that with time and consistent changed behavior on our part, you might consider a closer relationship than Patricia has felt able to maintain with our parents." "That depends entirely on your actions moving forward," I replied honestly. "Words matter, acknowledgement matters, but sustained change in how you relate to me will determine whether real reconciliation is possible." "We understand," my mother said, reaching across the table but stopping short of touching my hand, respecting the boundaries I'd established. "We're committed to that change, Eliza. Not just for a few weeks or months while this is fresh, but permanently. The therapy is part of that commitment, holding ourselves accountable with professional guidance rather than falling back into comfortable patterns once the immediate crisis has passed." As we continued our meal, the conversation shifted to more concrete aspects of our relationship moving forward. We discussed how future family gatherings might be structured differently, how achievements, mine and Tyler's alike, would be acknowledged, how the financial amends would be formalized to ensure transparency. "Tyler mentioned you're considering advanced nursing education," my father said, neither dismissive nor overly enthusiastic, simply inquiring. "I've applied to a nurse practitioner program," I confirmed, "focusing on psychiatric mental health. It's an area where I feel I can make a significant impact, especially given the current shortages in mental health care providers." "That sounds like important work," he replied, and I was struck by the absence of the subtle diminishment that usually accompanied discussions of my career. No comparisons to more prestigious medical specialties, no suggestions that I aim higher or differently, just straightforward acknowledgement of the value in my chosen path. "When do you expect to hear about your application?" my mother asked, showing genuine interest. "Within the next few weeks. The program starts in January. We'd like to support your education this time," she said carefully. "Not to erase the past inequality, which can't be undone, but to provide now what should have been provided then." I considered this offer, aware of the complex emotions it stirred. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain complete independence, to succeed without any assistance from the parents who had withheld it when it mattered most. But another part recognized that refusing support offered genuinely and without conditions would be a reaction to past wounds rather than a decision based on present circumstances. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "The financial amends you've already made provide me with options including self-funding, but I appreciate the offer and what it represents." By the time we finished our meals, the conversation had acquired a rhythm unlike any we'd experienced in my adult life. More honest, more equal, with space for disagreement without the pressure to concede to parental authority or maintain a facade of perfect family harmony. "There's something else we wanted to discuss," my father said as we waited for the check. "We're planning a family gathering next month. Not a formal reunion like before, but a smaller dinner at our home. We'd like to publicly acknowledge both the past inequality between you and Tyler and your recent professional accomplishments. I raised an eyebrow, surprised by this suggestion. Public acknowledgement is important, I agreed cautiously. But it needs to be done in a way that isn't performative or designed primarily to alleviate your guilt. We understand that concern, my mother said. We thought perhaps you might help us plan it, to ensure it meets your needs rather than ours. And of course, only if you feel ready for such a gathering. Their willingness to cede control of the narrative, to allow me to shape how our family story would be presented to others, represented perhaps the most significant shift in our dynamic. Control of the family image had always been paramount to my parents, with uncomfortable truths carefully obscured beneath polished surfaces. I'll consider it, I said, neither committing nor refusing outright. I'd want to discuss it with Tyler, as well, to ensure we're aligned in how this is approached. My father nodded, accepting this conditional response without the push for definitive agreement he would have insisted upon in the past. Of course, take whatever time you need. As we prepared to leave the bistro, an awkward moment arose, the question of whether our parting would include the formal hugs that had long been part of our family script regardless of underlying tensions. My mother solved the dilemma by speaking directly to it. I'd like to hug you, Eliza, but I understand if you're not comfortable with that yet. Physical affection shouldn't be an obligation or a performance. Her awareness of this subtle aspect of family dynamics, the way physical gestures could be used to enforce a narrative of closeness that might not reflect emotional reality, showed a depth of reflection I hadn't expected. Thank you for understanding, I said, genuinely appreciative of this small but significant respect for my boundaries. I'm not ready for that level of closeness yet, but I'm open to continuing the conversation we've started today. We parted, with handshakes instead, formal perhaps, but honest in their acknowledgement of where our relationship currently stood. Not the false intimacy of obligatory embraces, but the authentic respect of equals navigating a challenging transition. Walking back to my apartment afterward, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Cautious hope, tempered by realistic awareness that sustainable change would require consistent effort over time. Relief at having been truly heard, perhaps for the first time in my adult life. Lingering sadness for the years of support and recognition I couldn't reclaim. I called Aunt Patricia that evening, wanting to share the experience with someone who uniquely understood the dynamics at play. They seemed genuinely committed to change, I told her after recounting the conversation. More than I expected, honestly. That's encouraging, she said, her voice warm but measured, and different from my experience with their generation. When I finally confronted my parents about the inequality between Frank and me, they acknowledged it but framed it as an unfortunate necessity of the times rather than a choice they'd made. Do you think people can really change these deep-seated patterns? I asked, the question at the heart of my cautious response to my parents' apparent transformation. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I believe change is possible, she said finally, but it requires sustained effort and external accountability. The fact that they're in therapy is significant. It suggests they recognize they can't simply will themselves to different behaviors without addressing the underlying beliefs that guided their choices for decades. What would you do if you were in my position now? I asked, valuing her perspective as someone who had navigated similar terrain. I'd proceed exactly as you are, with cautious openness. Allow them to demonstrate changed behavior over time, without either prematurely trusting or permanently closing the door to reconciliation. Her voice softened. But I'd also remember that your healing and forward movement doesn't depend on their transformation. Whether they're capable of sustained change or not, your path forward is yours to determine. Her words resonated deeply, reinforcing what I'd begun to understand during the months since the family reunion. The confrontation had been necessary, not primarily to change my parents, but to free myself from the weight of unacknowledged truth, from the endless striving to prove my worth to those who had systematically undervalued it, from participation in a family narrative that diminished my experience. The following week brought news about my graduate school application, acceptance into the nurse practitioner program with a merit scholarship covering 40% of the tuition. The achievement was entirely my own, based on my academic record and professional experience, unconnected to family influence or financial support. I shared the news with Tyler first, appreciating his genuine excitement and pride without the competitive undercurrent that had often characterized our interactions throughout our 20s. "This is incredible, Eliza," he said during our video call. "Though not surprising given your track record. When do you start?" "January. It's a 2-year program with clinical rotations beginning in the second semester. Will you continue working at the hospital while you study?" "Part-time," I explained. "I've arranged a reduced schedule that aligns with my course load. It will be challenging but manageable." Tyler nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Have you told Mom and Dad yet?" "Not yet. I wanted to process the news myself first, decide how I want to approach sharing it." "They mentioned the family dinner they're hoping to plan," he said, "to acknowledge both the past inequality and celebrate your achievements. Rebecca and I think it's a good idea, but only if you're comfortable with it." I appreciated his centering of my comfort rather than our parents' desires. "I'm considering it." The dinner itself isn't the issue. It's ensuring it doesn't become a performative gesture that allows everyone to feel better without substantive change. "I understand that concern," Tyler agreed. "What if we approach it as a first step rather than a resolution? A public acknowledgement that creates accountability for ongoing change rather than a neat conclusion to an uncomfortable chapter." His framing resonated with my own thinking. That makes sense. And having both of us involved in planning it would ensure it serves genuine reconciliation rather than image management. After our call, I sat with the decision for another day before reaching out to my parents about both the graduate program acceptance and the proposed family dinner. Their response came jointly via email, congratulations that felt genuine rather than perfunctory, specific recognition of the achievement rather than vague pride, and a suggestion that we meet again, this time with Tyler and Rebecca included, to plan the family gathering in a way that would serve meaningful reconciliation. 3 weeks later, we gathered at my parents' home, my first visit there since the confrontation at the reunion. The house looked the same, yet felt different. My perception of it transformed by new understanding of the family dynamics it had contained. My mother had prepared lunch, and we sat around the dining table discussing both practical logistics for the upcoming dinner and the deeper purpose it would serve. "We've drafted a statement," my father said, sliding a folder toward me. "What?" "We plan to say to the extended family about our past choices and commitment to change. We'd like your input before finalizing it." I opened the folder and read the document inside, Tyler looking over my shoulder with equal interest. The statement was more forthright than I'd expected, acknowledging specific inequalities in how we'd been treated, taking full responsibility, without deflection or qualification, expressing genuine regret for the harm caused, and outlining concrete steps for making amends and changing behavior moving forward. "This is comprehensive," I said, genuinely impressed by the unflinching accountability it represented. "It needs to be," my mother replied. "Half measures or vague acknowledgments would only compound the original harm." We spent the afternoon refining the statement and discussing how the dinner would unfold. Who would speak when? How my recent academic achievement would be celebrated alongside the accountability for past inequality. What boundaries needed to be established with extended family members who might attempt to minimize or dismiss the importance of the reconciliation process. Throughout the planning, I noticed subtle but significant shifts in how my parents engaged with both Tyler and me. They listened more than they spoke, considered our input without automatic dismissal of perspectives that differed from their own, acknowledged the expertise we each brought to different aspects of the conversation. The change wasn't perfect or complete. Old patterns occasionally emerged in reflexive responses before being consciously corrected, but the effort toward transformation was evident and consistent. As the afternoon drew to a close, my father disappeared briefly into his study, returning with a small wrapped package. "This isn't part of the formal amends," he said, handing it to me. "Just something I found recently that seemed important to share." I unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. Opening it, I recognized my father's precise handwriting, the dates indicating entries beginning shortly after my high school graduation and continuing intermittently over the years. "It's my professional journal," he explained, seeming uncharacteristically vulnerable. "I've kept one throughout my career, noting significant cases, career developments, reflections on decisions. I rediscovered this volume while doing some personal inventory work our therapist suggested." He gestured toward specific pages he'd marked with small tabs. "If you look at the highlighted entries, you'll see something I didn't fully recognize myself until recently. How often I wrote about your accomplishments with genuine pride and admiration, even while failing to express those feelings directly to you." I turned to the first marked page, dated during my sophomore year of college, reading my father's private reflection on learning about my selection for a competitive clinical rotation, despite working 30 hours weekly to support myself. Eliza secured the emergency department placement everyone competes for, all while maintaining her course load and working more hours than many full-time employees. Her determination is extraordinary, though I worry about the toll of such a punishing schedule. Should we reconsider financial support? Diana concerns about creating dependence, but cost-benefit merits discussion. The entry revealed both pride in my achievement and at least consideration of intervening in my financial struggle, consideration that had never translated to action or been communicated to me directly. Other marked entries followed a similar pattern: private acknowledgement of my accomplishments coupled with ambivalence about how to respond to them, admiration that remained unexpressed, concerns that went unaddressed. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked, uncertain how to feel about this glimpse into my father's unshared thoughts throughout years when I'd perceived only criticism or indifference from him. "Because I want you to understand that my failure to support and celebrate you appropriately wasn't because I didn't recognize your value or achievements," he replied carefully. "It was because of my own limitations, inability to separate appreciation of your accomplishments from anxiety about your choices diverging from the path I'd envisioned, difficulty expressing admiration directly, fear that acknowledging the financial inequality would require confronting the wrongness of our original decision." He ran a hand over the journal. "These private reflections don't excuse my public failures. But I hope they might help you understand that beneath the disappointment and criticism you perceived was genuine pride, I lacked the emotional tools to express appropriately." The journal represented something beyond the formal acknowledgments and apologies offered previously, a window into the complex inner landscape that had shaped my father's outward behavior, the unresolved tensions between his genuine appreciation for who I was and his attachment to who he'd expected me to be. "Thank you for sharing this," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It doesn't change what happened, but it does add another dimension to my understanding of it." As I prepared to leave that evening, journal in hand, my mother approached with similar tentativeness. "There's something I've been wanting to ask," she said, "but I wasn't sure if it would be appropriate given where we are in the reconciliation process." "What is it?" I prompted when she hesitated. "I'd like to spend a day with you at the hospital, observing your work if that's permitted. Not to evaluate or judge, but to better understand the career you've built and take genuine interest in rather than measuring it against outdated standards of prestige or success. The request surprised me, so contrary to her previous dismissive attitude toward nursing as a practical career beneath our family's professional aspirations. "I'd need to get approval from administration," I said, "but shadow experiences are sometimes permitted for specific purposes. Why do you want to do this?" "Because I've realized how little I actually know about what you do," she admitted. "I've minimized your career based on abstract hierarchies of prestige rather than understanding the actual impact of your work or the expertise it requires. That's a failure I want to address through genuine interest and first-hand observation." Her request reflected perhaps the most fundamental shift in our relationship, from judgment based on preconceived notions of value to curiosity about my actual experience and choices. It represented the difference between being seen as a disappointment, measured against external standards, and being recognized as a person with my own valid path. "I'll check about the shadowing possibility," I said, finding myself genuinely open to the opportunity. "But regardless of whether that specific arrangement works out, I appreciate what the request represents." The family dinner took place 2 weeks later, a carefully planned gathering of 20 relatives, including my grandmother Margaret, and remarkably, Aunt Patricia, who had flown in from Seattle specifically for the occasion. The evening unfolded with a deliberate structure that balanced acknowledgement of past harm with celebration of present achievements. My father delivered the statement we'd crafted together, standing at the head of the table with my mother beside him, their public accountability shifting the family dynamics in visible ways. Some relatives appeared uncomfortable with such direct confrontation of long-hidden truths. Others seemed relieved, as if the acknowledgement freed them from participating in pretense they'd recognized but felt unable to address. When my recently accepted graduate program was announced and celebrated with the same enthusiasm previously reserved exclusively for Tyler's accomplishments, I felt a circle beginning to close, not in the sense of an ending, but in the completion of a necessary revolution that transformed the family's understanding of itself and my place within it. Aunt Patricia found me in a quiet moment on the patio afterward. "This is more than I ever expected to witness in this family," she said, genuine wonder in her voice. "Actual accountability, genuine recognition of harm done, authentic celebration of your path. It's healing, even for wounds I thought had scarred over decades ago." "Do you think it's sustainable?" I asked, the question that continued to hover beneath my cautious optimism. She considered this thoughtfully. "I think their commitment is genuine. The therapy, the public accountability, the concrete steps they've taken, these suggest change rooted in genuine recognition rather than temporary performance." She smiled, lines crinkling around her eyes. "And more importantly, I think you've developed the strength and clarity to maintain your boundaries regardless of whether their transformation proves consistent over time." This, perhaps, was the most significant outcome of all, not what had changed in my parents, but what had changed in me. The confrontation at the family reunion had catalyzed not just potential reconciliation, but fundamental transformation in how I understood myself and my relationship to family expectations and approval. In the months that followed, as I began my graduate program with a combination of self-funding and the contribution my parents had offered, which I'd ultimately decided to accept as part of the reconciliation process, the changed family dynamics continued to evolve. There were missteps and moments of regression, old patterns occasionally resurfacing before being recognized and addressed. But the foundation had shifted from pretense to honesty, from unacknowledged inequality to conscious effort toward fairness, from judgment to genuine interest. My relationship with Tyler deepened in unexpected ways. Our shared understanding of the family dynamics that had shaped us both creating space for authentic connection, rather than the unconscious competition that had characterized our earlier interactions. He began exploring architecture courses in the evenings, taking first steps toward incorporating his long-suppressed interest into his life. inspired partly by our conversations about authentic choices and delayed dreams. The financial amends provided practical freedom, but the psychological liberation proved even more valuable. Freedom from the constant need to prove my worth through achievement. Freedom to define success on my own terms rather than in reaction to family expectations. Freedom to engage with my parents based on who they were now, rather than remaining trapped in the dynamics of the past. As I sat in my first graduate seminar, surrounded by colleagues pursuing similar advanced training in psychiatric mental health nursing, I felt a sense of alignment between my external circumstances and internal values that had often been missing in previous achievements. I was there not to prove anything to anyone, but because the work itself held meaning for me, because the path I'd chosen, despite and perhaps partly because of its challenges, was genuinely mine. The journey that had begun with that moment of truth at the Hayes family reunion continued to unfold in ways I couldn't have predicted. Reconciliation wasn't a destination reached through a single conversation or gesture, but an ongoing process requiring sustained effort from all involved. Yet the foundation had been laid for something healthier than what came before. Relationships built on truth rather than comfortable fictions, on mutual respect rather than hierarchies of value, on genuine interest rather than judgment against predetermined standards. The inequality that had shaped my early adulthood couldn't be erased. The years of struggle couldn't be undone. But in confronting that reality openly, I had discovered something unexpected. Not just the possibility of changed family dynamics, but the certainty of my own worth independent of external validation or comparative advantage. The most valuable outcome wasn't the financial amends or even the transformed family relationships, but the unshakable self-respect that came from standing in my truth and requiring others to see me accurately, with all the complexity of my journey acknowledged and valued. As I walked home from that first graduate seminar, autumn leaves crunching beneath my feet, I thought of something Aunt Patricia had written in a recent email. The most powerful legacy you can create from inequality experienced is to ensure it stops with you, not just in how you engage with your family of origin, but in how you move through the world, the standards you uphold, the accountability you require, the self-respect you maintain regardless of external circumstances. That legacy was already taking shape, not as a conclusion to a difficult chapter, but as the foundation for everything that would follow. A future built not in reaction to past wounds, but in alignment with authentic values, genuine strengths, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from transforming adversity into purposeful growth. My first year in the nurse practitioner program unfolded at a demanding pace. Clinical rotations in psychiatric facilities throughout the city, rigorous coursework on psychopharmacology and therapeutic modalities, weekly case presentations that required deep analysis of complex patient situations. Each element stretched my capacities in different ways. Yet, unlike the grueling years of my undergraduate education, this intensity felt purposeful rather than punitive, challenging in ways that fostered growth rather than merely testing endurance. The financial freedom resulting from both the amends, payment and my merit scholarship allowed me to reduce my hospital hours to a manageable 20 per week, creating space for genuine learning rather than mere survival. For the first time in my academic career, I could focus on mastery rather than just completion, on excellence rather than adequacy, on genuine intellectual curiosity rather than credential acquisition. 6 months into the program, Professor Abernathy, the director of the psychiatric mental health track, asked me to stay after class. A formidable woman with 3 decades of clinical experience and a reputation for accepting nothing less than excellence, she had become something of a mentor, despite her intimidating demeanor. "I've been watching your work, Hayes," she said, shuffling through the case presentation I'd submitted the previous week. "You have an unusual combination of technical precision and intuitive understanding of psychological dynamics. It's rare to see both in such balance." "Thank you," I replied, still unaccustomed to straightforward praise without qualifiers or comparisons. There's a research opportunity I think you should consider, she continued. Dr. Meredith at the Trauma Recovery Center is launching a study on innovative approaches to treating healthcare workers experiencing burnout and secondary trauma. She's looking for clinicians with both medical background and psychiatric training to join the research team. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. That sounds fascinating, but my schedule is already quite full with coursework and clinical rotations. Professor Abernathy nodded, her expression softening slightly. I'm aware of your commitments. This would replace one of your standard rotations, not add to them, and it could potentially develop into a thesis project if the focus interests you. The opportunity was exactly the kind I would have automatically declined in the past. Convinced I needed to stick to the standard path, worried about disappointing authority figures by choosing differently, afraid of overextending already limited resources. Now, I found myself considering it on its actual merits rather than through the lens of scarcity and fear. I'd like to learn more about it, I said. Healthcare worker trauma is certainly an area where specialized intervention is needed, especially after the pandemic years. Professor Abernathy's approval was evident in her brisk nod. I'll connect you with Dr. Meredith. Don't feel pressured to accept if it's not the right fit, but do give it genuine consideration. Your perspective would be valuable to the project. That evening, I called Tyler to share the news. Our weekly conversations had become a touchstone in my life, evolving from careful navigation of family tensions to genuine connection as siblings, and, increasingly, as friends. That's fantastic, Eliza, he said when I described the research opportunity. It sounds perfect for your interests. It's definitely intriguing, I agreed, though I'm trying to be thoughtful about adding new commitments. Tyler chuckled. The old Eliza would have already said yes and figured out how to manage the impossible schedule later. The old Eliza was trying to prove her worth through constant achievement and self-sacrifice, I replied, smiling despite the serious undercurrent. The new version is attempting to make choices based on genuine interest and sustainable boundaries. Speaking of boundaries, Tyler said, his tone shifting. Mom called me yesterday about Thanksgiving. They're hoping you'll join us this year, but wanted me to ask informally before they extend an official invitation. The consideration implicit in this approach, checking my comfort level before making requests, represented one of the consistent changes in my parents' behavior over the past year. Small but significant shifts in how they engaged with me had gradually accumulated, demonstrating that their commitment to changed patterns was more than performative. I think I'd like that, I said, surprising myself with the ease of the decision. The new dynamic still feels strange sometimes, but in a positive way. It does, Tyler agreed. I keep waiting for Dad to revert to his controlling approach or Mom to make subtle digs about my parenting choices, but they're really maintaining the changes. The therapy seems to be making a genuine difference. Our conversation drifted to his children, his tentative exploration of architectural studies, Rebecca's recent promotion. The easy exchange of life updates without competition or comparison had become our new normal, a relationship based on mutual support rather than the unconscious rivalry our parents had fostered. The following week, I met with Dr. Meredith at the Trauma Recovery Center, a modern facility dedicated to innovative approaches for treating post-traumatic stress and related conditions. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with quick movements and intense focus that conveyed both brilliance and impatience. Professor Abernathy speaks highly of your clinical instincts, she said after introductions, leading me through corridors filled with soft lighting and thoughtful design elements created to foster psychological safety. And your background in emergency nursing provides first-hand understanding of the environments we're studying. I've certainly witnessed the toll emergency work takes on healthcare providers, I acknowledged. Both the acute trauma of critical incidents and the cumulative strain of chronic stress. Exactly what we're examining, Dr. Meredith nodded approvingly. Current protocols for provider support are woefully inadequate. Most institutions offer superficial wellness programs that place responsibility on individual resilience rather than addressing systemic factors. Our research aims to develop interventions that address both personal and organizational dimensions. As she outlined the research protocol, I found myself increasingly engaged. The opportunity would allow me to contribute to developing supports for the colleagues I'd worked alongside for years, professionals whose dedication often came at significant personal cost. The time commitment would be 15 hours weekly for the next 6 months, Dr. Meredith explained, including direct clinical work with healthcare workers seeking treatment, participation in research team meetings, and contribution to protocol development. In the past, I would have immediately calculated whether I could squeeze these hours into an already demanding schedule, push myself further, sacrifice more personal time in pursuit of professional achievement. Now, I took a different approach. That sounds substantial, I said thoughtfully. I'd need to carefully consider how to integrate this with my existing commitments. Could I review the detailed project description and get back to you next week? Dr. Meredith looked momentarily surprised, perhaps accustomed to eager students immediately accepting any opportunity offered, but nodded. Of course, take the time you need to make a considered decision. The careful evaluation process that followed reflected my evolving relationship with achievement and opportunity. I consulted with my academic advisor about integrating the research with my program requirements. I reviewed my financial situation to confirm I could reduce hospital hours without creating stress. I considered the genuine alignment between this project and my developing professional interests. Throughout this deliberation, I noticed the absence of a once familiar voice, the internal pressure that had driven so many previous decisions, the desperate need to prove my worth through constant achievement, the fear that any missed opportunity represented failure rather than choice. In its place was a calmer assessment. Was this opportunity aligned with my values? Did it represent meaningful contribution or merely impressive credentials? Would accepting it require sustainable adaptation or harmful self-sacrifice? After thoughtful consideration, I accepted the research position, negotiating adjustments to my clinical rotation schedule that allowed integration without overwhelm. The project began in early spring, bringing me into collaboration with a diverse team of psychiatrists, psychologists, and fellow nurse practitioners specializing in mental health. My specific role focused on designing interventions for emergency department personnel, adapting trauma treatment protocols to address the unique stressors of that environment, while accommodating the practical constraints of shift work and demanding patient loads. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying, combining my first-hand knowledge of emergency settings with my developing expertise in psychological intervention. 3 months into the research project, an unexpected email arrived from Aunt Patricia. Eliza, I've been following your graduate studies and research involvement through our conversations, and I'm consistently impressed by the thoughtful way you're building your career. The integration of emergency medicine and psychiatric mental health seems perfectly aligned with both your skills and values. I'm writing with a specific purpose today. As you know, I've built my consulting firm over the past 25 years, focusing on organizational dynamics and leadership development primarily in healthcare settings. At 62, I'm beginning to consider the firm's future beyond my active involvement. This isn't an immediate transition. I plan to remain fully engaged for at least another 5 years. However, succession planning requires foresight, and I've been contemplating who might eventually carry the work forward. Your combination of clinical expertise, psychological insight, and personal experience navigating complex systems makes you uniquely qualified for the kind of work we do. I'd like to invite you to consider a gradual involvement with the firm, perhaps beginning with occasional consultation during your breaks from academic study, potentially developing into a more substantial role after you complete your certification, if the work resonates with you. This isn't an obligation or expectation. It's an invitation to explore whether this path might interest you. with full understanding that you're currently focused on your immediate academic and clinical development. There's no pressure to respond immediately or positively, just an opening I wanted to make you aware of as you consider your longer-term professional trajectory. Whatever you decide, I continue to admire the thoughtful, boundary-respecting way you're navigating both your career and our complex family dynamics. With warmth and respect, Patricia. The email left me momentarily speechless. Aunt Patricia's consulting firm was nationally respected, working with major healthcare institutions on leadership development and organizational transformation. The possibility of eventual involvement represented a potential career path I hadn't previously considered, one that could integrate my clinical expertise with broader systemic impact. More than the professional opportunity itself, I was struck by the way it was presented, as a genuine invitation rather than an expectation, offered with explicit acknowledgement of my agency and current priorities, extended based on recognized value rather than familial obligation. The contrast with how opportunities and expectations had been presented throughout my childhood could not have been more pronounced. I didn't respond immediately, allowing myself time to metabolize the possibility without pressure. When I mentioned it to Tyler during our next conversation, his reaction surprised me. "That's remarkable, Eliza," he said, genuine excitement in his voice. "The work Patricia does is exactly at the intersection of your interests. Clinical care, systems thinking, organizational change. And the way she's approaching it, no pressure, long timeline, emphasis on mutual fit, shows such respect for your autonomy." "It does," I agreed. "So different from how opportunities were framed in our family growing up." "Completely different," Tyler nodded. "No implicit obligation, no suggestion that your worth depends on acceptance, no manipulation, disguised as support, just a genuine recognition of your abilities and an invitation to consider whether the path interests you." His articulation of these distinctions confirmed my own perception, that Patricia's approach represented healthy opportunity offering rather than the conditional support or manipulative expectations I'd experienced throughout childhood. The invitation itself was valuable regardless of whether I ultimately pursued it, modeling a way of recognizing others' potential without attempting to control their choices. As spring transitioned to summer, my graduate studies intensified with comprehensive exams approaching. The research project at the Trauma Recovery Center evolved as preliminary findings suggested promising directions for intervention development. My reduced but ongoing work in the emergency department kept me connected to direct patient care while providing financial stability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.